I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detlef, and I am your head of household for the week.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I'm the have-nots over here. I'm eating the slop.
That's right, folks. Big Brother Canada is back. It premiered this week, and it's all we can think about. It's eating up all of our DMs.
We got the regular DM going. We have a DM with our partners. And listen, Big Brother Canada is a special TV show, and I love it so much.
There are a few greater bonds of solidarity beyond watching Big Brother Canada together.
Holy crap! I like regular Big Brother too. When I say regular, I mean United States Big Brother. Sorry, I don't want to be too imperialist here, but. but Canadian Big Brother is so good because everyone is better, less racist, and also the production value on the show is extremely high, and that is something that I love. Yep,
I agree. So if you really want to get in the Magnificast good graces, you can start watching Big Brother Canada from the ground up this year. You can get in on it early. You can join our group DMs and everything, I guess.
We will start a Magnificast Christian Marxist Big Brother Canada group DM, and you can be a part of it.
That's right. You heard it here. All right. This is not a Big Brother Canada podcast yet.
It could be, though.
The Christianity and leftist politics thing. And specifically this week, we're going to talk about Ernesto Cardenal. It might seem kind of weird. We did just talk about him a few weeks ago, but he died on March 1st at 95 years old. We'll say a lot more about it shortly, but we just thought he's a really important character and somebody who's become more and more meaningful to us since doing this podcast, really. And we're going to spend some time talking about him, just like we did when Paul Virilio passed away. He's just one of those big, important people who's really shaped how we think. Before we do that, though, Matt, you've got a Reddit out here.
That's right. Sorry to break the mood of a very somber and respectful podcast about our favorite Christian left hero with something from Reddit, but I'm going to do it anyways because it's part of it. It's all part of it here.
It's all part of it.
This is from reddit.com/r/Christianity. It was posted one day ago, and it's a pressing question for you, Dean. Okay. The title here is Gods. That's it.
Right.
So the user writes, so I was watching a Bible Project video. I don't know what that is, but it's not important. About the Divine Council. Everyone knows about that. And it left me wondering, is the Bible referencing the gods and goddesses of Egypt, Roman, and Greece as evil celestial beings who want to be God? So, Dean, what do you think about that? Is the Bible referencing them, other gods, who are evil celestial beings, or not? What's your take about the sort of history of religion here?
Yeah, of Egypt, Roman, and Greece. I think it must be
the three countries that definitely exist.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, we've all seen the Bible Project videos, and this is something that has come up a lot for me too, as I watch them, thinking about the Divine Council. I guess, I think in ancient times, in ancient Bible times, when they would say gods, people don't know, but we have a tendency to see the ancient world as so far removed. And I think they really used gods the way that we do to speak about things like rock gods and just, the gods of sports. They're just extremely powerful people that you want to be like. I think that's what it's referring to.
That could be. Yeah, I mean, we all know about the Egypt, Roman, and Greece evil celestial beings who want to be God, but who are the evil celestial beings in our own society that want to be God? That's the bigger question for me.
It is. Who are the Egypt, Roman, and Greece gods of our own time?
Man, well, we just might never know.
We might not.
This is one of the questions for the philosophers to think about, maybe not us. People with degrees in philosophy, I don't know if we can answer this. The other philosophers, though, they can do it.
Because yeah, exactly. I was going to say, we've got degrees that should make us qualified to do that. So it's the thing is, this is a question for Bible scholars. And
that's right. That's true. That's not us. The Bible scholars could tell us about the evil celestial beings. Truth be told, I picked this question because I just wanted to say evil celestial beings a lot, and I'm loving it so far. It's really enjoyable.
It's a hard one to say. I haven't said it once, and I don't think I'm going to, because I was born in rural Michigan, and I don't know if people who listen to this podcast know, but I can't say half the words that I try to say. So
no.
They just mumble out of my mouth. Like, I can't, there's too many s's in what you're saying. I think I shouldn't give that one a shot.
Yeah, the thing about evil celestial beings is that they do make regional accents that make it hard to say their own names. So something to think about there.
Exactly. Yeah, if I was born in Roman, then maybe I could say it, but I wasn't.
That's true. If you were born in Roman, it would be less of a problem.
All right. Well, that was a great upper. Let me introduce a downer, because that's what this podcast is like. Just ups and downs, mood swings galore. But there's so much to say about Ernesto Cardenal, and I want to get us there, because he is a hero of ours, like we said. So Ernesto Cardenal died March 1st, 95 years old. Like I said, we just talked about him on the Poetry Arc, but he's someone worth kind of sending him off, I think, in a real way on the podcast. So we've talked about Cardenal 2 other times besides the Poetry Arc. He's shown up a couple of times. The first was all the way back in episode 40, which feels like forever ago now, when we did a Christmas show themed around the book The Gospel in Solentiname. That is a collection of conversations that Cardenal had, that he recorded with different people in the community of Solentiname reading the Bible together. So that was one. And then the other was in an episode 101, when we talked about Pope Francis restoring Cardenal as a full priest in the Catholic Church, which is something that was taken away from him by Pope John Paul II in 1984. So we kind of talked about, like, what's going on there, why does it matter, why is it a big deal? So we've done this kind of brief bio on Cardenal before, and you've probably heard some of it, maybe even just recently, but we did our best to sort of pull it all together for this one. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then when you're sick of telling Cardinal's story, you can send it back to me.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I don't know. It's fine to rehash things because, listen, you probably don't remember this. At least I don't think you do, unless you're taking notes on what we say, which would be, I don't know, pretty bizarre. So here is Cardinal's life in a nutshell. Ernesto Cardenal. He was born in Granada in 1925. He spent most of the 1940s traveling around to Mexico, the U.S., and throughout Europe. In 1950, he came back to Nicaragua, and 4 years later, he was part of a failed coup against the Somoza dictatorship. After it failed, he moved to Kentucky and lived in the same Trappist monastery with Thomas Merton in 1957. And that was just a huge deal for him. He was trying to decide whether or not he wanted to be a monk or if he should be a priest. And Thomas Merton was extremely influential on Ernesto Cardenal. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. If you're interested in that particularly, the Christians of the Nicaraguan Revolution book is for you, but we'll get to that later. A couple years later, he went on to study theology in Mexico to become a priest, and eventually he went back to Nicaragua. where he ended up being ordained in 1965. He became the priest of Solentiname, which is a chain of islands in Nicaragua. He was the leader of a radical arts commune community, and also worked with leftists to foment revolutionary energy while he was serving as a priest. His brother Fernando, who was a Jesuit priest, so two priests, there we go. These two priesty boys, was also part of the Solentiname crew. They were all there together. So after, being in Solentiname and starting this whole thing, he went to Cuba in 1970 and in 1971. You can read about that in a book called In Cuba. But that trip was really influential. The trip itself, seeing Cuban society, he says that that's what made him a revolutionary. After Cuba in 1977, his community in Solentiname was brutally attacked and he fled to Costa Rica. After the success of the Sandinista Revolution, he was named the Minister of Culture in the revolutionary government, and 3 other priests, including Fernando, also took up posts in the government, which is what got JP2 just so dang pissed at these good priest boys. So there's a lot going on there and a lot left out for sure too, but his life is a wild one. It's one that is, very exciting. Would definitely watch it in a movie.
Yeah, same. The Ernesto Cardenal biopic definitely needs to be made. As the Minister of Culture, Ernesto Cardenal also did a lot of really fascinating things. So post-revolution, he taught poetry workshops across the country, which were really fascinating. We've talked about those in the past. And he encouraged people to explore other kinds of art forms. He was also a sculptor and a painter, and he saw all that as part of the revolutionary project. So it wasn't just a matter of getting all the material stuff sorted out. The revolution should give opportunities for people to express themselves differently, artistically and spiritually. And he also wrote a ton of poems himself over the years, and that's like before the revolution, during, and afterwards. You can really kind of see his poetry dealing with those different phases of life. Toward the end of his life, he was doing a lot of poetizing on science and religion and politics all at once. So if you want to read poems about the divine force of love and being a revolutionary and quantum physics all at the same time, you know where to go. Some poems are literally just those 3 things all put in a big blender. Cardenal has been mourned throughout the world, and in Latin America in particular, he's a hero of the continent, even as an artistic person. So not just as a revolutionary, but as an artist of the region. In Nicaragua, the government declared 3 days of mourning throughout the country, which is a pretty big deal because Cardenal has been a critic of the present Sandinista government under Ortega. There's a lot of stuff going on there. There was a big falling out many years ago, and Cardenal has been something of a dissident voice, even though still a leftist. So it's significant that the government still declared those days of mourning. Communist papers and publications have been celebrating him, and since the Magnificast is all about communism and Christianity, we decided that we should celebrate him too. So one book that we haven't talked about on the show before is a book called Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution that Matt just mentioned. It's a book of interviews done by the journalist Margaret Randall. She did a ton of other books of interviews like this. She did some work with women in Nicaragua and interviews with people in Cuba. Really great journalist. But in this book, she talks with Cardenal and some of the members of the Solentiname community in 1983, which is a few years after the revolution ousted Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, in 1979. So that year is pretty significant, 83, not only because it's so close to the revolutionary success, but it's also a year before he has his Cardenal has his priestly duties suspended. So we read that book for this episode, and we each pulled out a few things about Cardenal that we think make him especially important for Christians and leftists. So that's how we're going to spend this episode, just kind of reflecting on his legacy and why he's a big deal and why you should know about him and why you should never get sick of hearing about him.
That's right. Well, before we get too far into it, let me make one big meta point about this book and like why I think it's so cool. If you've been listening to the Magnificast, if you've heard the other Cardenal episodes, you've heard about the Gospel in Solentiname, you've heard about a lot of his poetry, and what's cool about those books is that some like characters emerge from them. Like in the Gospel in Solentiname, there's like Loriano, and there's Elvis, and there's Donald, and all of these kinds of like I don't know, these folks from Solentiname who have like a lot of character in these books and in these poems. And this book, Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution, is really cool because you actually get to read interviews with these people after the fact, after Solentiname is kind of like over for the most part and the revolution's over. So anyways, all I'm trying to say here is that this is like Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution is like the keystone of like a Nicaraguan socialist Christian text that holds it all together. It's the trilogy in the Cardenal cinematic universe or something. So anyways, I think it's a really important book if you're interested in this like particular time period and this topic. So it brings it all together. You get to hear like what happens to Donald and Elvis and like where are their bodies found and that kind of stuff. So it's wild.
Yeah, and you can find it on archive.org. It's worth mentioning for free.
Important, yeah. Otherwise you can't buy it on Amazon or whatever. It's old and out of print. Archive.org though, or maybe from your library, who knows. Okay, cool. Well, before we get into that book particularly, let's talk about how folks are remembering Cardenal. So let's see. I think I first, there are some popular United States press pieces about them, but we'll skip right over those because bourgeois press, no thank you. And let's read it straight from the communist mouth. Right after his death, Granma, the paper of the Cuban Communist Party, published a handful of things about Cardenal's life and his death. And one thing that kind of sticks out is a quote that they had from Cardenal about his time in Cuba that I thought was pretty good and interesting, and kind of gives you some broader context for the way that Cardenal was sort of shaped by the Cuban Revolution, but also Cardenal himself. So here's a quote from Ernesto Cardenal in Granma, kind of remembering his life. So Cardenal says, "My experience in Cuba became something fundamental for me. It has been the most important experience of my life after my religious conversion. It was in reality a conversion to the revolution. Before, I believed that we should look for a third way in Latin America, but in Cuba I found that the way was theirs, and that the revolution was very good, and that there was a duty to support it." So, I mean, there's nothing like groundbreaking here, but this reflection here is pretty good. It tells you how important Cuba was to not only Latin America, but also to Ernesto Cardenal. It was this turning point in his life towards socialism. He wasn't just sort of like a radical priest, but he becomes kind of converted to the cause of socialism. And yeah, I mean, a lot of other stuff happens here too, where Cardenal kind of like becomes persuaded that maybe violence sometimes is okay for revolutionary struggle and that kind of thing too. So Cuba was a big deal for his life, and this is the blurb that Cuba is using to remember Cardenal and his importance to them. Yeah, it's really interesting to pull that out too, because so he visited Cuba in 1970 and 71. He's born in 1925, so he's like almost 50 years old at this point when he has this extremely revelatory moment or whatever. And that, to me, is always just a standout thing about Cardenal. I mean, he was a radical for a lot of his life, no doubt about that. But he really becomes a revolutionary, when he's well into his adulthood. I think that's just a really kind of amazing thing. Like, he was an older person in the revolution, and for him to have that sort of political awakening in Cuba and to move beyond that third way thing into a revolutionary position is just impressive. Yeah, I mean, on that same note, he wasn't a priest until pretty late in life as well. I think he was 40 when he actually became a priest. So, right, gives me a little bit of hope. maybe I'll do something important in my life still. Who knows? Yeah, exactly. All right, so we pulled out a few themes from this book, Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution, and some quotes to kind of get us talking about them, and that'll maybe just give us an excuse to riff a little bit and talk about Cardenal's importance. So the first theme I want to get on the table here is Cardenal offers us what you could call a revolutionary interpretation of Christianity. So he's a Christian working with Christian materials, really trying to think about what it means for him to be a priest and all that kind of thing, but he is doing that in light of the participation in a revolution, and especially in these interviews with the success of that revolution in hindsight. So here's one thing that he says here.
You should take note that Sandino is the Nicaraguan revolutionary from the 20s, from which the Sandinistas get their name. Sandino says somewhere that the final judgment is not going to happen after death. It will take place on Earth, when there are no more exploiters. And we, without reading that text of Sandino, we discovered, reading the book of Revelation, that it's clear that it doesn't refer to the end of the world. Destruction with a neutron bomb or something like that. It's the end of the unjust society and the beginning of the new society. In the Gospel in Solentiname, Laureano says, I'm 21. I want this new kingdom to happen soon. I don't just want me to see it, I want it to happen in 2 years. And he goes on to talk about how before his religious conversion, as he describes it, he had like a pretty, average idea of God. He says, if you were to ask me who God is, I would simply say that he's someone with whom I communicate, someone that I get along with. And then he goes on to say he has kind of a more like mystical idea of God now. And I think that's one thing that is just of persisting importance that Ernesto Cardenal opens up is the kind of interpretive freedom to revisit the biblical text and also Christian tradition with your eye on what would it mean to change my material situation? How would that change the way that I read this text? And how would it change the way that this text reads me or suggests things to me? And at least for me, like reading the Gospel in Solentiname for the first time was really an eye-opening thing. Just something that gives you permission to get playful with those kinds of texts and figure out what they might say.
Yeah, it's a really good connection because in the Gospel in Solentiname, he's like, I mean, the Gospel in Solentiname is an interesting book because if you're looking for like hot, juicy quotes from Ernesto Cardenal, you're not going to really find them. And instead, you're going to find like a lot of hot, juicy quotes from like peasants and farmers in Nicaragua.
Right.
But I mean, they're doing, just what you said. They're like revisiting these texts that, they've probably grown up reading or, and studying in the Bible or whatever. And they're like, well, they're revisiting like the story of Mary and like what the Magnificat means or what it means for Jesus to be tempted in the desert or something. And they're like, well, Mary's a communist and the devil's an individualist capitalist or something, and like these different funny takes on the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. There's also a lot of interesting things in this book about how Cardenal reinterpreted different liturgical practices and things like that too. Like, and even there's some stories he tells of like baptizing people in the sink in the kitchen or something because that's like all they have and they want to have that sacrament and it's very important to them, which is like a pretty big scandal to traditionalist Catholics. But what I love about Ernesto Cardenal is like, well, this is how Catholicism looks like in a revolutionary situation. Like, if you still want to have it, then you got to work with what you've got. And I feel so, just kind of, I feel lighter when I read Cardenal talk about what it means to be a Christian, because it's kind of like, well, it's extremely important to him, obviously, but it's important because it can really activate things inside of you. Like, it's not just instrumentalized for the revolution. He really does believe that, like, there's something revolutionary about it, and you shouldn't get too worked up about, reproducing the kind of conservative Catholicism of the past or something.
Yeah. Part of the book that we're not really spending much time talking about is in the very sort of first few pages, the book focuses on Ernesto Cardenal's time in Gethsemane in Kentucky with Thomas Merton. And I think some of that sort of like lightness or like sort of playfulness with tradition does come from Thomas Merton in some senses too. What's wild, I guess, kind of illuminated to me now that I've read this book is that Solentiname, it wasn't going to be in Solentiname at first. It was going to be in this other place. And Thomas Merton was like sort of like the energy behind a lot of it. Ernesto Cardenal thought he wanted to be a monk, and Thomas Merton is like, don't do that.
Yeah, right.
Don't be a monk. You could go and do something else. So he convinces him just to be a priest instead, and that they're going to go start this like radical community in Latin America or whatever. And Thomas Merton is like really pretty like adamant that like, that they're not going to wear a habit there. They're going to wear different types of clothes, and they're going to like, have these sort of like reformed sort of experiences. So I think there's some of the background there with Merton is kind of interesting too, because that's what Thomas Merton's sort of like project here that Thomas Merton doesn't end up getting to follow through with in any sense, ends up getting, this plays out in Ernesto Cardenal's life in this really wild way that I'm sure Thomas Merton was probably not thrilled about in sometimes at least.
Yeah, that's right. There's a whole exchange of letters between them that's been published, by the way, if people are interested in that. It's pretty recent. And it is fun to look through. But yeah, no, I think you're right. That connection is true. Thomas Merton also has a kind of interesting, playful relationship to the tradition, and that no doubt rubs off on Ernesto Cardenal. It'd be interesting to learn more maybe about where they diverge on the kind of revolutionary interpretations of the Bible. But yeah, like, what's wild about Cardenal is he is somebody who's so capable of mixing together forms of ideology or sources that you might think shouldn't go together, but in Cardenal's hands they feel so natural. Like in the poems that we've read in the past, like I said earlier, you've got in the same kind of page sometimes a meditation on the atomic nature of the universe, and then how like revolutionaries die and they become atoms or whatever, and God is kind of the force that binds it all together. Like that's all kind of in the mix, and you see that here too in the quote that I was just reading. Like he's borrowing from Sandino. He's talking about what Sandino thinks about the final judgment. He's borrowing from like the threat of nuclear war, and he's also talking about like contemplative monasticism. Like there's so much kind of there that I guess if I tried to talk about it that once, I think I would just sound totally incoherent. But when Ernesto Cardenal is talking about it, it's like, oh, all of this actually does fit exactly the way that you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. He's, talented with language, that's for sure. His poetry is evidence enough of that, though. Yeah. Cool. Well, do you want to move on to maybe the next thing, or should we talk about something different? Okay. Cool. So the next thing that we pulled out here were some of Ernesto Cardenal's thoughts on class division in Christianity. And I think these kind of stuck out to me because, I don't know, class divisions in Christianity are something that people don't like to talk about very often, if ever. I have a colleague, former colleague, I guess, who always told me that, Christians, they should always be... Christians anywhere in the world should always have some type of unity between them because they should have more in common because they're Christians than anything else. And boy, is that a weird idea, because class divisions cut deeper than people's faith in Jesus most every time, or it skews the way that they think about Jesus, explicitly. So Ernesto Cardenal has a lot to say about class divisions. And there's also some ideas here too that remind me of Herbert McCabe's Christianity or Class War and Christian Love. But anyways, we'll talk about that maybe in a minute. So this is what Ernesto Cardenal says: "It won't be a division like the division between Catholics and Protestants." I'm sorry. So Ernesto Cardenal is setting up that there's going to be this like new division in Christianity, but he says that it won't be a division like the division between Catholics and Protestants. Cardenal goes on to say, that is, it won't be a break with the Pope and the Pope's authority. Theology is not in question, and neither is our loyalty to Rome's authority. Here the division will be a political division, as great as the others, but for political reasons. Now there is a need to unite not only Catholics and Christians, but those of all faiths. Every day there is more unity. This is not a time for disunity. People already know about the importance of Christians in the revolution. We also have to talk about the participation of Muslims in the revolution, the integration of revolutionary Christians, revolutionary Muslims, and revolutionary Buddhists with Marxism. Fidel always said that Christians could be revolutionaries, that Christianity could be revolutionary, that the early Christians were revolutionaries. He had repeated this from the earliest speeches to today. He said it to me when we first spoke. He was ahead of all the theologians of liberation who later discovered that it was possible to be a Marxist and a Christian. Okay, so this is a really interesting, prediction, but also not really much of a prediction because it's, always kind of already happening. But anyways, he's foreseeing a division in the church, not one that's about theology or the authority of Rome, whatever, but instead political division. And this is, I don't know, like spot on. This is true. This is happening in the United States just as much as probably in Nicaragua or wherever, right? That there are extremely conservative Christians who put their class interests before their Christian interests, before a preferential option for the poor, or even a care for the poor. Anyways, and the idea here is that, like, what do you do in the face of that? Like, Christians have to come together Christians have to come together, whether, you're Catholic or not, or whatever, or even if you're a person of another faith in some other type of unity, the participation in a revolutionary project as people of faith. And I think that's really good. The only way to combat sort of like, class war in faith spaces is to pay attention to class. And I don't know. It's a good reminder. It's a good thought.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's like the difference between calls for solidarity and calls for unity, I guess, are like different kinds of things. Yeah, I like so much about what's going on here for a lot of reasons. I mean, for all the things you were just saying, right? The admitting that disunity does exist in a certain respect, or like divisions are real, and those divisions are along class lines and not just along ideas or something like that. We should definitely talk more about that. What I think is also fascinating about it is, so Nicaragua was like the hotbed for the development of what was called the People's Church. And so people had suggested that basically the Sandinistas were trying to create something like a Protestant Reformation within the church, which Ernesto Cardenal was really keen on saying is not the case. But what's so fascinating about it is, like, communists are always saying class war isn't something that, like, we get up and decide we want to participate in. It's just something that's happening, and you either recognize that it's happening or not. Like, you don't ask for it. It's imposed. And so you have to choose a side. And I think that's what Cardinal is saying here too, right? Like, they're not trying to create a division in the church. If anything, they want people to rally around the right kind of unity. It's just that the divisions do exist. And this was actually dramatized pretty significantly in 1983 when Pope John Paul II visited Nicaragua. There's a pretty famous story of him going to a huge public mass where there were I found this Washington Post article where it says there were 350,000 people there who chanted while he was giving his homily, "One church on the side of the poor, and we want peace." And they chanted it so much that the Pope was forced to stop his homily and order silence, or silencio, because he was so pissed. And yeah, it's a huge scene, and it's like it caused a massive event, I guess, in the church, as you might suspect, and it's one that kind of, I think, really formed Pope John Paul II for the rest of that century even. But in all of that, what's so fascinating is, like, again, you can see Cardinal anticipating that these are divisions that are just happening in the church that you have to recognize or not. You can't just say silencio and expect for them to go away, because they don't. And I don't know, it's just like a very... it's the kind of thing that you can say if you're formed by class struggle, because you recognize that these kind of divisions happen all over the place, and Christianity is just not immune to it.
Yeah, totally. I think that, the sort of classic Marxist position that, like, class war is happening whether or not you want to participate, and if you know how to look at the situation, I suppose is a good one, right? Like, I don't know. I'm just thinking of, like, my experience growing up in church, where, like, no one would ever have even talked about the importance of class or whatever, right? It's like completely something that would get pushed under the rug, or it's just like, Jesus loves you whether you're rich or you're poor. But, like, the point of class struggle in church is that, like, well, why are there people that are poor? Like, why is that something that you're even, like, allowing? Why is that even within the sort of, like, equation of the community of church in the first place? So yeah, I don't know. I agree with the Nicaraguan people. Church on the side of the poor.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, it's like, again, like, the Pope could have just said, yeah, like, you're right, and they all would have said that's great. Right? Like, it's not the case that they just, like, even wanted to topple the Vatican or something. Like, Ernesto Cardenal is heartbroken, and so is Fernando Cardenal heartbroken. over the ultimatum that was eventually given to them by John Paul II of basically you have to keep your post or take a break from being a priest, which is a pretty huge ultimatum to give somebody who's dedicated their life to both of these things. You can read both of their reflections, Fernando and Ernesto, on it. They're really kind of difficult to read because they are so painful, I guess. But that's the worst part of it is like they said, or like Cardenal says, theology is not in question, and neither is our loyalty to Rome's authority. The division is a political division, right? And like, if John Paul II wanted to be on the right side of that division, the problem will be solved, but he chose not to be. So, you know, it's not just up to him to decide whether or not the divisions exist.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's not just a Catholic problem either. You know, go to any Protestant church, and it's the same thing. Ask your pastor, which side are they on? What do they tell you? It'll be an interesting question. They'll invite you out for coffee. Don't do that, though. Don't let them trick you into it.
Coffee invitation is the ultimate smoothing over of all difference.
That's right. If you ask your pastor whether or not they're on the side of the poor, and they say, well, let's have some coffee and talk about it, go to a new church. Don't ever go back. Run as fast as you can.
You should say, you know what? Actually, why don't you come meet me at the picket line and we'll talk about it?
Yeah, that's right. Go find a strike. There's tons of them. They're every day. You can find one for sure.
Well, that leads into another thing that we wanted to pull out and that I think is really important, that Cardenal teaches us and really embodies, and that's basically that Christianity isn't just a series of ideas or platitudes or even moral codes, but it's actually something that needs organizing. Like, it needs some help. If you just go to the Bible for everything, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You could come up with some weird ideas. And in this book, it's great, Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution, because so many other people in Solentiname are interviewed, and they talk quite a bit about Ernesto Cardenal and other priests too. And I was really struck by this one passage from a guy named Manuel, who was part of the community, where he says, the most important thing we learned in our dialogues with Ernesto was that the system had to be changed. The only way forward was to take up arms to change the system. You couldn't do it any other way. If we waited for God to take Somoza away, it wouldn't happen. God put us here on earth to cultivate the land and organize ourselves. But God is not going to come and say, here, I'm going to make this guy president, and when he's screwing you around, I'll take him away. No, it's people who have to organize themselves and the communities. And, I mean, what an insanely, profound thing to have gifted a community of people with the idea that, yes, it's good that you get organized and God even wants you to do it. I don't know. That really sticks with me as something that it would be good if people could say that about you somehow as a Christian down the line, right? That this person taught me that God wants me to get organized.
Yeah. Isn't it? It's such an interesting, well, okay, it's interesting to talk that way in light of sort of the current sort of political situation in the United States, which is obviously very different than Nicaragua. But so in this formulation where Ernesto Cardenal is telling them that God wants them to, get organized and depose the government, that's like, God is on the side of the poor. God acts through the poor. God is kind of cooperating with a certain group of people who have a certain amount of power in society. But if you juxtapose that with the ways that the Christian right has done the exact opposite, it's pretty bizarre if you think about it, because so in the one you have God on the side of the poor, and Ernesto Cardenal is kind of pushing it that way. But on the other hand, we have all these wild Christian right folks thinking of Donald Trump as sort of a divinely inspired David character or whatever, right? A shitty dude that is going to do great things for Christians. But it's just this interesting way that I don't know, an alternate way, I guess you can think of God present in sort of the political moment. I don't know, weird thing that my brain did.
Yeah, I dig it. It's good. I like it too because it cuts through the ideology of what else God is and isn't doing, right? I love when Manuel says God isn't going to say, here, I'm going to make this guy president, and then when he's messing around, I'll take him away. That's like not how it works. And that's great because, you know, so many Christians do have the knee-jerk assumption that like, well, the authorities are there because that's what God wants, because of like some strange passage in Romans or something. And, you know, like Manuel's basically being like, you know, that would be absurd. Like, it wouldn't make any sense. To assume that God wants Somoza to be in power would be to assume that God is genuinely evil. You should oppose that God 100%. Like, Somoza, I mean, maybe people don't know, but, like, Somoza was bad. He was a bad man who did a lot of bad things. But just to give you one example that I use when I teach this in classes sometimes, Somoza had like an owner, he was like part owner of a company that took the plasma of poor Nicaraguans and sold it to blood banks in the United States. And it's like you couldn't get more on the nose with like a villainous vampire president than that. And so to assume that God had divinely appointed somebody like Somoza to run the country and, you know, one day would just get rid of him would be to have an extremely horrifying and violent theology. And I like that Manuel is basically like, Ernesto taught us that that's not how it works. Like, there's a different way to think about God, and there's a different way to think about, you know, what we've got to do.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's good to set that precedent, though, because otherwise, I don't know, like, how else do you... like, Christian evangelicalism is so saturated in that, like, weird Romans, like, God ordained the president kind of way of thinking that Ernesto Cardenal's intervention is important for them to hear. Well, this is along the same lines, but a little bit of a different situation. So this is a quote from a whole different thing. But when we were talking about this passage before the show, this kind of stuck out in my brain. So in 1986, there was an interview with Ernesto Cardenal and some folks, 3 people whose names don't mean anything to me, so whatever. In this, they interviewed him in something called the Agni Review. Again, not a significant publication, at least for me. We found it in JSTOR. Thank you, JSTOR. Anyways, within this interview, it's like really interesting. Cardinal goes into like all of the different leftist parties that exist in Nicaragua at the time, and how there are like these 3 different Marxist-Leninist parties, and one is sort of leaning towards Maoism, and like, isn't that interesting? Whatever. But there's like this one question that one of the interviewers asked Cardinal that I thought was really funny, and Cardinal's response is even funnier. And it's worth getting into for a second. So, anyways, the interviewer asks, "You have said in another interview that for you, poetry is above all prophecy in the biblical sense of guidance. How would you guide your people now in the face of recent events in Nicaragua, such as the trade embargo? What do you see in the future?" Okay, so the question is well-meaning, right? Biblical guidance. You're so wise. You're a poet. All these things. What does that biblical sense of guidance tell you to do in the face of a trade embargo? And Cardinal says this: "For the moment, I still don't know what we should do in Nicaragua. The Bible's prophets were never so specific about things this concrete, feeling that the prophecies they gave the people were ample guidance. In every concrete case, it is more difficult to launch into a prophecy because a mistaken prophecy may come about." Anyways, this is funny because it's just like, yeah, I don't know. What do you do? The prophets never talked about trade embargoes. Isn't that bizarre? But you know, it's a similar point though, that Christianity gives you a lot of good motivations and a lot of sort of like orientations when it comes to ethics and to politics. But when it comes to trade embargoes, you need other things like Marxism, Leninism, or or the Sandinistas, or you know, or Mao, or whatever. You need a sort of like different a different toolbox when it comes to things like trade embargoes.
Yeah, I like too the idea that the prophets aren't so concrete, thinking that the prophecy they give is kind of enough. Like, that's enough guidance that you need. It's suggestive more than it is predictive or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is a good way to read the Bible, but B, a good way that Cardinal understands his own role, I feel, as a Christian person in the public eye there. When you read through the Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution book, you really see that come through as well. And I was struck by it. I mean, you know, we're reading the text of a real life conversation, so who knows what it actually was like. But the impression that I just get, the way that Ernesto talks and the others are talking, thing is Ernesto Cardenal often kind of takes a back seat and just lets other people talk for a long time. And then when someone eventually is like, Ernesto, what do you think about it? Then he'll speak. And usually he speaks to kind of set something else up or like provide a new frame or something like that. But he doesn't strike me as the kind of person who's like, and this is just how it is. Or he doesn't even have the kind of like Fidel level of like, adamant confidence or something. It's just kind of, it's very gentle and very, I don't know, like, very like he's trying to sort of coax things out of others, and I think that really speaks well to even that prophetic character. So many people talk, and I do too, about the prophetic spirit of the Bible being this kind of intense commitment to justice and speaking the truth to power and all that, and I think that's true, and it's true of Cardinal, obviously, but this idea that prophecies are actually about just giving ample guidance, like just enough to kind of know where you're going. I feel like Cardinal really embodies that sort of thing. Yeah, definitely. Well, he's all about that type of, he's all about that life of contemplation. So he's not going to be quick to tell you the answers. You got to think about it. It's all that Kentucky monastic training. Kentucky monastic training has like just the right sort of like sing-songiness of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I really like that. That's right. Colonel Sanders, indeed. Dang. Well, I don't know. What are the big takeaways about Ernesto Cardenal's life? He lived a good one, a real long one. He did so many things. He instructed so many people. What do you think we should learn from him? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I feel like I'm still trying to sort out exactly what Cardinal means to me. For some reason, he just keeps getting bigger and bigger in my brain and in my life. I feel that he models so perfectly the kind of relationship between Marxism and Christianity that I feel resonates with my own kind of life story. Like, I didn't become a priest at 40 years old. I guess there's still time. But the idea that, like, Christ is the person who led him to Marx, that's like a quote that people often say. And I feel very much resonating with that. The idea that the world is really complicated, but you can sort of figure out how to hold all these things in tension. Like, that modeling is something that I wish I was better at and would like to get better at. So I guess I have to read a lot of Cardinal to figure it out. I think that's what it is. Like, he provides a model or some kind of aspirational disposition toward the world that I just can't really help but respect and sort of think that there's a lot to mine there, especially for Christians and Marxists both, right? Like, Marxists trying to figure out how to engage Christians, well, you should definitely read Cardinal because he did it, right? He earned a spot in the revolutionary government, and vice versa. Like, Christians trying to figure out how to engage Marxism, Cardinal made his whole life basically trying to do that. So I think just a person who has great thoughts and also has some material proof behind him, some bona fides. Yeah. What about you, Matt? Well, you took everything I was going to say, and that's fine. No, I agree. I think Ernesto Cardenal is... He's just our guy, He's like the he's the guy that's doing all the things that we really like, and who live this like wild life that is incredibly inspirational. Gonna get a big Ernesto Cardenal tattoo. It's gonna be great. Something I appreciate about Ernesto Cardenal is I think his way of like, just like mishmashing everything together and like making it seem so natural that it's completely just the way that it is. So I'm thinking about this one poem that he has particularly that we read back on the poetry arc, and I can't remember exactly the name of it, but it's about seeing the letters FSLN on the side of a hill, right? And he's thinking like about divine signs and like asking God to like, show him the way or show a miracle or whatever. And then he's like kind of like thinking about it himself. And it's like, holy shit, did we have a revolution here? Did we actually win that? And I think that's amazing because it is a way of like, doing a big mashup of I don't know, of materialism, of like actually doing socialism in the world, but also thinking about it as a type of miracle, as a type of intervention, and the same type of intervention that
that we were just talking about too with Manuel, like if you don't like the God doesn't put the president there, he puts you there to take the president out or whatever. And it's sort of a similar idea of thinking through sort of like God's bound upness with the world, through human sort of interaction with it. And like, that's good. That's a really interesting way of thinking about the world. Thinking about like divine intervention and like God's plan for the world or whatever, like other weird, cringy evangelical ways we have of talking about it suck. And I hate it. And I think that there's a type of like spiritual practice or way of thinking about God and sort of like the way God gets stuff done in the world in Ernesto Cardenal that I find really appealing and helpful and interesting.
Yeah, I like all that. So you didn't take everything.
Nope, not all of it. Just that one big idea I had.
No, that's really good though. I totally agree. Well, I feel like, I don't know, there's so many ways to send Cardinal off. I know that we've both been reading a lot of his own poetry after he died, especially because he talks quite a lot about death. And before the show, Matt and I were both looking through some of these poems and thinking, well, what's the best one to kind of send it off? And it's hard to choose because there's just so many great meditations that he has on death and what it is and what it isn't and how it relates to life. But the one we settled on was a poem that's called In the Tomb of the Guerrilla Fighter, which just felt like a good way to, I don't know, have Ernesto Cardenal's words about somebody else maybe be about him for a minute. Do you want to read it, Matt, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll read it. In the Tomb of the Guerrilla Fighter. I think of your body that has been falling apart beneath the earth, becoming soft dirt, humus once more. Together with the humus of all other humans who have existed or will exist on this small ball of the world, all of us together becoming the fertile earth of this planet Earth. And when the cosmonauts see this blue and pink ball in the black night, what they'll be seeing far away is your luminous tomb, your tomb and the tomb of everyone. And when extraterrestrials from some place see this point of light from the Earth, they'll be seeing your tomb. And one day it will be all tomb, silent tomb. And then there will no longer be any living being on this planet, compañero. And afterwards we'll fall apart more. We'll fly, atoms in the cosmos. And perhaps matter's eternal, brother. Without beginning or end, or it has an end and starts again each time. Your love surely has a beginning but has no end. And your atoms that were in the soil of Nicaragua. Your loving atoms that gave their life for love. You'll see, they'll be all light. I imagine your particles in the vastness of the cosmos like signs, like living posters. I don't know if I explain myself. What I know is that your name will never be forgotten, and that present will be shouted forever. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/themagnificast. We also got a store on Redbubble where you can buy lots of stickers and t-shirts, and maybe we'll even make something Cardinal related, or maybe not. It's hard to say what we'll actually do. If you can't support us in those ways, that's totally cool. Capitalism sucks, we get it. You can also just leave us a review on iTunes or on Stitcher or whatever other podcast platform you might use. We'd really appreciate that too. Cool. Well, the intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and the outro music, as always, is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.